Now, imagine this for a moment. You're living in Judea during the first century. Your nation has been conquered by another nation. You feel disheartened. You're completing your chores under the heat of the burning sun. After the work at hand is done, you take a sip of wine, as it stays better preserved than water. As you're looking at your task, now completed, you wonder about the future of your own large family. Will things get even worse under the occupation with all the unrest it causes? Things have gone so bad that even some of the members of your own people have started collecting taxes from their own kin for this occupying pagan nation. The future doesn't seem too bright. You seek solace and guidance from religion. But even your own people are divided amongst themselves. You're getting a bit confused on what to believe and whom to follow. So, let's take a look at some of these groups and their beliefs. It's important to understand the terms used in this video. The word Jew can refer to someone who belongs to the Jewish ethnic group or to someone who follows the religion of Judaism. The two are often tied together, but there are secular Jews too. The term Jew originally referred to someone that is a member of the tribe of Judah, and it was later used to refer to someone who is a member of the kingdom of Judah. A synagogue is a Jewish worship place. The Torah means the same as the law, the scriptures written by Moses, basically. In the Christian Bible, those books would be called Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Hellenization means the adoption of Greek culture by people who are not Greek. Before delving any further into the topic at hand, you should also know these things. First of all, the kingdom of Israel was split into two kingdoms. The northern kingdom was called the kingdom or the house of Israel, and the southern kingdom was called the kingdom of Judah. Only the tribes of Judah and Benjamin, with some members of the tribe of Levi, remained, since the other tribes were gradually assimilated by other peoples following the conquest of the northern kingdom by the Assyrians in the year 721 before Common Era. Judea had been occupied by the Romans since the year 63 before Common Era. The four main Jewish groups in the first century were the Pharisees. I'm sure you have heard about them before, by the way. Sadducees, Essenes, and Zealots. The form of Judaism practiced in the first century was what we would call Second Temple Judaism. Well, what does it mean then? What is Second Temple Judaism? Well, here's an explanation. Second Temple Judaism is the term for the Jewish traditions during the timeline between the rebuilding of the temple in Jerusalem by the returning exiles from Babylon and the destruction of it by the Romans in the year 70. Unlike under the first temple, under the second temple, the priesthood became independent as opposed to being subordinate to the kings, as the monarchy and the state were at the hands of foreign rulers. Modern-day Judaism is called Rabbinic Judaism. The main differences between Second Temple Judaism and Rabbinic Judaism being the following. Second Temple Judaism did not focus on the Talmud or the so-called oral law. Rabbinic Judaism isn't centered around the temple as the temple was destroyed. One very important difference that I should also mention, even though I haven't written it down here, is that modern Judaism is mostly led by rabbis or teachers and not by priests. So let's start with the Pharisees. I am sure you have heard about these guys before, but just in case you have ever wondered about what does a Pharisee mean? Well, here's your answer. The term Pharisee is derived from a Hebrew word with the meaning to separate. I have seen some claims that the Pharisees did not name themselves Pharisees, but the name was given to them by other groups to mock them. But I'm not sure myself, so take it with a grain of salt. The Pharisees were seen as more relatable to the common folk as opposed to the Sadducees, as they, the Sadducees, were upper class elites. The Pharisees opposed Hellenization. Modern day rabbinic Judaism is rooted in the teachings taught by the Pharisees. Here are some of the Pharisee beliefs and practices. The Pharisees accepted the oral law as equal to Torah. They were strict followers of tradition, and they believed in resurrection and life after death. It's important to specify that they believed in bodily resurrection. They believed in free will, but also believed that God has foreknowledge about the future. And they supported the local synagogues as places to study the Torah and as places of worship. So they were basically decentralizing the Jewish faith away from the temple. But they did also participate in worship at the temple, as it was required by the law. Despite being strict followers of tradition, they had a rather progressive way of interpreting the law, as they added some of their own ideas to harmonize with the law. According to the Gospels, and depending on the translation, the Pharisees fasted either twice a week or twice during the Sabbath. Well, what does the Sabbath mean? The Sabbath is a Jewish day for resting and focusing on spiritual things rather than working for material wealth. The Sabbath lasts from Friday evening to Saturday evening. The Pharisees promoted the idea of every Jew following the priestly purity laws and temple rituals in their regular, everyday lives. They also built their houses near one another so they could share meals during the Sabbath, as the Sabbath restricted the distance one was allowed to travel during the day. Let's continue with the Sadducees. The Sadducees were aristocratic upper class. They were based around the temple in Jerusalem. As they ran the temple, they emphasized priestly privileges, as most of them were priests. The term Sadducee might have been derived from the name of the high priest during King David's and King Solomon's time, as his name was Zadok, and being the high priest during King Solomon's reign would have meant that he was the very first high priest of the temple. The Sadducees favored Hellenization, causing conflict with the Pharisees. They also collaborated with the Romans. The Sadducees ceased to exist as a group after the destruction of the temple in the year 70, as it was the cornerstone of their sect. The Sadducees rejected the oral law. The general consensus is that they only accepted the Torah as sacred, but some argue that they did accept other scriptures, but their interpretation was different. The Sadducees did not believe in an afterlife, and they did not believe in angels either. They did believe in total free will. I felt like it was important to include the Sanhedrin in this video as well. The Sanhedrin was the ancient Jewish court system. There was not just one Sanhedrin. There were several smaller local Sanhedrins. A lesser Sanhedrin would consist of 23 members. The following is a direct quote from Wikipedia. The 23 judges on the Lesser Sanhedrin are derived from the following exegesis. It must be possible for a community to vote for both conviction and exoneration. The minimum size of a community is 10 men, thus 10 versus 10. One more is required to achieve a majority, 11 versus 10. But a simple majority cannot convict, and so an additional judge is required.
12 versus 10. Finally,
a court should have an odd number of judges to prevent deadlocks, thus 23 rather than 22. End quote. The Great Sanhedrin was the equivalent of a modern Supreme Court, and it was located in Jerusalem. It consisted predominantly of Sadducees, which partly explains why Stephen appeals a lot, especially to the Torah. In Acts chapter 7, the Great Sanhedrin lost its authority to inflict capital punishment around the year 30, which is why it makes sense that the Romans were required to sentence Jesus. Now, let's take a look at the Essenes. They were a group of monastic mystics, and they had less members than Sadducees and Pharisees. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, they had around 4,000 members. It is speculated that the Dead Sea Scrolls in Qumran were written by the Essenes, though there are some counter-arguments against the theory. So what were the Essene beliefs? They believed that they were the continuation of the legitimate Sadducite priesthood, and they also believed in predestination. They believed in the immortality of the soul. This differs from the belief of the Pharisees, as they believed in a bodily resurrection, as shown by the belief in the immortality of the soul. They were influenced by the Greeks and the Persians. They also waited for a Messiah to destroy the evil of the world. Well, here are some of the Essene practices. They didn't take part in worship at the temple, as they thought that the temple had been corrupted by the other sects. They lived in isolation, in a strictly communal way of life with each other. And I may add that, at least according to Josephus, they did not live in one single large community. Instead, they lived in several smaller communities around Judea. They likely had collective ownership over material possessions, or at least over some of them, but it's very possible that they did have collective ownership over every material possession. Their priests did not marry and lived in celibacy instead, which was not the norm for Jewish priests, as they usually married. The Essenes were only allowed to carry weapons for self-defense, and they were also forbidden from swearing oaths and taking part in animal sacrifices. And now that we have mentioned that, we should also mention that they seem to have been strict vegetarians with some dairy use. So, let's move on to the topic of Zealots. The Zealots were a political movement with driving out the Romans from Judea as their main goal. They were founded in the year 6 and dissolved in the year 73, though it has also been said that they were not one unified group until much later than the year 6. They had the same religious views as the Pharisees, but did not accept the Roman rule, unlike the Pharisees, who saw it as a necessary evil. They refused to pay taxes, and they terrorized the Romans and Greeks with violence. They allied themselves with the Edomites out of desperation during the Zealot temple siege. I find this interesting, as the Edomites were a people that the Jews and the Israelites had shared a lot of tensions with during their shared history, even though it was forbidden for the Israelites to hate Edomites, as the Edomites were basically a brother nation to Israelites. As the Zealots had taken control of Jerusalem a few years prior, they would keep Jerusalem under their control until the Romans sacked the city in the year 70, destroying the temple in it as part of the process. Now, let's talk about the Sicarii. They are thought to be a splinter group of Zealots, but the Jewish historian Josephus mentions both of these groups separately from one another, but we are not quite sure about the differences between them. The Sicarii were named after the small daggers that they would carry, called Sicarii. They hid their daggers in their cloaks and then pulled them out to strike Romans and people deemed as Roman sympathizers, after which they would blend into the crowds in an attempt to escape without detection. They also killed Jews if they saw them as apostates or traitors. They became the dominant rebel faction after the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple in the year 70. According to the Jewish historian Josephus, members of the Sicarii took part in mass suicide at Masada, which was a fortress they controlled, in the year 73, seeing it as more preferable to surrendering. As you may see, Judea during the 1st century was full of political unrest. Now, here's a quick summary of the transition into Rabbinic Judaism, or into the Judaism as it's known today. The destruction of the temple in the year 70 left the Jews in a crisis, as their worship was centrally organized around the temple before the destruction. With the destruction of the temple, the Sadducees ceased to exist as a group, as their influence was so heavily centered around the temple. The Zealots were crushed by the Romans, and the Essenes disappeared. These events led into the Jewish religion being reshaped into what is known as the Rabbinic Judaism, based on the Pharisaic doctrines. The rabbis, or teachers, became the religious leaders, as there hasn't been a Jewish high priest since then. The oral law was written down as the Mishnah during the 3rd century. The Mishnah is currently a part of the Talmud, which is a large collection of the rabbinic texts. It is very important to remember that modern-day Judaism is not exactly the same Judaism that Christianity split from. This was just a brief summary, and I hope this video worked as a fine introduction to the topic for you. And hopefully you learned something new. Have a great day, friend, and farewell.